At Simio, we're in the business of showing you the future. Our intelligent technology gives you unprecedented insight into complex systems to identify and solve today's inefficiencies and tomorrow's challenges. The Simio solution provides a low-risk opportunity to drive transformational change. Our true digital twin models capture all the constraints, business rules, and decision logic that define the operation of your system. When powered by your data, easily evaluate unlimited scenarios and deliver optimized solutions. No matter what industry you're in, eliminate your greatest operational process and scheduling challenges with a Simio digital twin. See your future success, Simio.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Simio Solution Series 2024, June 13th. My name is Dan Vasilini. I'm the Vice President of Global Sales over here at Simio, and doing most of the presenting today is going to be Liz Millar. You will see at the bottom of the screen a QR code. We're always looking for feedback on our solution series, as well as any type of future suggestions you may have. If you're watching this recording live today with us, if you could scan that QR code and give us some feedback, or if you're watching this session on record or on a recording, it would be great if you scan that in and give us some feedback. We're always looking for it, as I said. Today's session is maintaining and debugging custom libraries. A couple of housekeeping items before we get going. So first, everyone, please be aware today's session is being recorded for replay purposes, as I just mentioned. If you'd like to rewatch this session or suggest it to someone, a friend, a colleague, anything like that, this session will be up on our webpage, simio.com, shortly after we are done today. It usually gets up within about 24 hours. So whether or not shortly is 24 hours in your mind, but it's usually about 24 hours or so. To get to our solution series, yes, yeah, exactly. Under the resource tab, there is a drop down for Simio Solution Series. You'll find all of our recordings right there that we've done. So going back to when we started these several years ago, any recording we've done is out there for you to go back and watch and rewatch if you'd like. Also, please be aware, today you are on mute when you come into today's session. If you'd like to ask a question, somewhere on your screen, you should see a little GoToWebinar dashboard. That GoToWebinar dashboard has a drop-down question box inside of it. If you'd like to ask a question, type your question in there. I try to address the questions, whether or not they are relevant or exactly relevant to what's being talked about, or if it's more generic in nature. I will sometimes interrupt the presentation and ask the question, or sometimes we'll hold the questions till the end. Today's session is scheduled to last about 60 minutes. Liz is probably going to be presenting almost the entire time. As I said, if you do have questions, please type them in. And if for some reason we don't get to them today, usually at the end of the presentation, I will flash our emails again so you can reach out to us directly if for some reason your question is not addressed today, or if there's something you see today that you'd like to dig into further and you just don't have a chance or an opportunity to type your question in. Future sessions. So we have one more scheduled right now for July, about a month from now, July 18th. It's going to be batching logic. We will be taking off August for like the summer break in a lot of parts of the world. And then we will be back again in September for our September, October, November sessions. Those sessions will be announced shortly with the topics and the exact dates. So just keep your eyes on your emails and or on the Simio webpage as we release those. With that said, one last slide. The QR code, once again, I'm going to flash it up, like I said, a couple times. You'll see it again there. So if you missed it the first time, you can scan it in here and give us your feedback. And like I said, if you're watching on record, please feel free to give us some feedback. We are always looking for it, and we are always reviewing those for any type of suggestions and or comments on this session. All right. With that said, I will stop presenting. I will turn it over to you, Liz, and the floor is yours.
Fantastic. All right, give me a second. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep, confirmation, can see it.
Perfect. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. As Dan said, my name is Liz Millar, and I am here to talk about libraries today. We're mainly going to be focusing on maintaining and debugging libraries, but we're going to kind of touch a bunch of different topics. With that, let's just jump into it. I actually want to start off in Simio and kind of do some refreshers on some terminology as we get into our library conversation. So as you open Simio, this is just a fresh new project here. In Simio, we have our standard library, a flow library, and extras library that are automatically loaded in to any project. And these are libraries that contain object definitions. So these are our definitions. These are our classes of objects. As we take a definition and place it into the facility, so here I have instantiated source one, I can place a bunch of source ones. These are instances of the source one definition. I'm just going to place a source into sync 2 and a model entity. So everything in my facility, these are the instances of their definitions. So anything that this object needs to know, it's kind of going to reference back to its definition for that logic. As we know, we can kind of change our properties on each instance so that our instances can be unique as well. But the kind of main logic that drives our instances is defined in our classes and our definitions. So along with our definitions, our instances, we also have our actualizations or realizations. So when we run, we see that our entities or things that are moving through our system, these are actually our realizations or actualizations of that entity instance, which has disappeared. But if you ever want to see it as you're running, you can turn on that visibility property. So that is our entity instance, and these are our entity actualizations. Keep that in mind as we're discussing our libraries and our projects today, just so we can kind of keep track of what's happening as we are changing our libraries and updating them. Okay, I also want to add that any project can become a library. So the project you're working in, the objects you see in your navigation pane, these are the objects you're actually defining in this project. So by default, we have our model and our model entity. These are our definitions we can go in and edit. So we expose our model entity because you might want to go in and add states, custom states to your entities. You know, you're building your model, you're defining what that looks like. So these are object definitions. Any project can become a library. You would just close this out, open a new project, and load in the project as a library. So you have the option to load library in your project home ribbon, or you can kind of click off to the side and load library over here. Right, now let's jump into some other example. So let's say I have been working on a project, and as we're going through these examples today, I really wanted to focus on the library aspects. So we're not going to get too much into building custom objects, but if you have more questions about building custom objects, I do recommend some of our Symbits or our help pages. There's a help page that kind of goes through how to build a custom object. So we're not going to focus too much on that today, but in this example here, I have already built some custom objects. So here I have this facility, and this is kind of my main model that I've been working on. And you could see that there's a few bigger objects here that are going to work together. Our big collection here I have called a conveyor system. So conveyor system is an object I have created in this project. I have defined it here, and we can see it's another grouping of objects. There's different instances of this custom server, and this custom server is another object I have defined in this project. So this is my first library I'm kind of looking at, and I also have a custom vehicle and a custom worker down below as well. A question we get a lot is how can, first, if I want to turn this into a library, how can I separate some of these objects? So in this case, facility is kind of my bigger top level model. And this might be where I'm, experimenting, collecting results. I have some things set up. But these smaller objects are making up this facility. And I actually want to split them off so I could have a library of this conveyor system and custom server, and a library maybe of my vehicle and worker objects. So somebody could go off and work on developing those objects while my facility is kind of intact and being updated in another location. So this is a good case where we want to create new libraries, and we want to make sure that all of these objects are still connected so that anytime I change the custom server or the conveyor system, my facility is still updated. All right, if we come across this situation, our first instinct might be to just take our model file, which in this case is project SSS v1, and you might just want to copy it, right? Because now I have a copy of this exact project with these exact objects, and I could just load that in as a library. But in this situation, we want facility to remain, and we could, delete these other objects. But if I try to load in that copied file, we're actually going to run into a problem. And the error tells us a little bit more information, but every project has a unique ID. So by copying that file, it's still the same project, it still holds its same project ID, and Simio does not allow you to have a library loaded that contains the same ID. All right, so that didn't work. My next idea would be maybe I make a new project. I load in that file again. And I'll just load in the copy. So now I have these objects here, and I want to create a new library, so I want to move them into this project somehow. You might think you want to subclass or copy them in. But that's not going to work either. If you copy an object, it's actually going to change its object ID. And the facility object that we're trying to have remember these objects will no longer remember it. It's kind of like creating a new whole definition that has no link to the things that are instantiated in this facility. So what do we do in this situation? We're going to jump back to my PowerPoint. We're going to talk about the differences between subclassing, copying, and cloning. So these are 3 ways that you might want to create a new definition based on something you have already spent time working on in Simio, because you have a starting point and we just want to continue creating a new definition from that starting point. We may be more familiar with subclass and copying. So subclassing is the option where you're going to inherit the parent class information. So any changes to the parent, the child class is going to get as well. Or copying, which is we're going to take this exact definition, copy it, and have that same starting point, but there's going to be no ties to its original definition. We're going to kind of build off from there. And then we have our third option, which we don't get to use very often, but that's cloning. So cloning is when we're going to create a whole new definition, but it's going to contain the same object ID. And this is only used for when we want to rearrange libraries, which in this case is what we want to achieve. A little bit to kind of demonstrate how this works. So when we copy, this is our copying example. So let's say we have a project ABC, and we created this really great definition called box. It's our object called box, and it has a object ID of 123. If I was to copy this box object into a new project, it would create this new box exactly as the current box is made, but it would give it a new object ID. Okay, so if I had my original box, 123, and I instantiated it in a project, I then loaded in my copied box, which is box 789, and I instantiated it, these would be considered 2 different objects because they go back to different definitions. I don't recommend having 2 definitions with the same name. It does cause some problems, but Simio does recognize these as 2 different definitions because they have a different ID. So if I made a change to box 789, so now it's a pink, and I tried to update my project, only box 789 would update. We would not have any changes to the original box 123, which could be good, could be bad. In the instance we are working on, we want to make sure that kind of all of the boxes are one definition, that we're updating the one definition. It's kind of the source of truth for this whole project we're working on. Let's consider cloning. So cloning, again, we have our box 123 in project ABC. I am creating a new project, and I'm cloning box into this project. That box has the exact same ID. So we're basically moving the definition from one project to another because this project XYZ is going to become our new library. So in that same example, we had project ABC. We instantiated some boxes from that project. We no longer want to use project ABC as our library. We've created our new library, project XYZ, and this new library with our same box definition has that same ID. So I can add in some more of those instances. And when I update project XYZ box definition, now it updates everything. So with what we are trying to achieve with our model, that is exactly what we want to get done. We want to move some of these objects into a different library by cloning them. So we're going to go through this fairly quickly. I'm actually going to make a new project. I'm going to load that project in. Oops, not the copy. And I actually want to have my facility in its own project, and I want to have my model entity A, conveyor system, and custom server in their own library as well, and then my vehicle and worker in a different library. So we're going to first move facility. To copy your clone, you need to go to your project library, and you can see your object or your options up here. You can also subclass from here, but there's other options to subclass from other locations as well. And we're going to clone from library, and we're going to move our facility here. All right, so we moved our facility in here. I'm going to remove these other definitions and say that this is my project that's only focusing on my facility. All right, I'm going to name this as facility. I'm going to open a new project. And again, I want to open these new projects because each new project I'm opening is creating a new project ID, which is going to allow these libraries to be independent from each other and recognized as different libraries. I am again going to load that same original project. I'm going to delete the definitions in here. And I'm going to use the clone option, and I'm going to move over my model entity A. My custom server. And my conveyor system. And I'm going to save this as my conveyor system library. All right, and then one more time. Oops, we're going to do file new. Load in our same original object. And we're going to remove those definitions, only because I don't want them in here. You could keep them in there if you want. And I'm going to move in my vehicle and my worker. And so now I could send this, this library off to someone who wants to focus on vehicle or worker development, and I could send my other library off to somebody who wants to focus on my conveyor system. And then all of my projects can come together back at the facility. So let's save as, and this will be my transporter. Oops. Great. Now if I go back to my facility, I do still have that original project loaded as a library. I no longer want to use that. I'm going to load in my facility. Nope, sorry, we're in the facility. My conveyor system library. And I'm going to load in my transporter library. Okay. Here, this is great if I wanted to add more, custom servers or conveyor systems, I could. But the thing that we really wanted to test is that if we make a change to either of these libraries, that my facility continues to update and remember that. So I have my conveyor library still open. Something that I like to do as I'm changing objects is I also like to make some sort of animation change, and that just helps me visually see when my objects update in the project where they're used, that they are updating to my newest version. So I have this little box up here. I'm going to color it a different color, in this case orange. And I'm going to say I want my custom server to now use some sort of reference property. So let's say we'll have this kind of front end processing time that we want all of these servers to use. And remember, we might use a property kind of to hold a spot as what this value should be. So when I instantiate this definition, I can pass that value in and it can be used instead. So this will allow us to kind of change something from the top level where this is instantiated. Right, I need to save my library. And something that did not work for a while, which was a little bit of a pain and we have since fixed, which is great, is now you no longer have to unload and reload your libraries for your library to recognize updates. So now I just have to go to Project Home and say check for updates. And it says that I have updates to my conveyor system library, which is great. So it recognized when I saved my conveyor system project that I now have things that should be updated. So it's just kind of warning me, are we sure we want to apply the updates? And we can see my little box has changed color. And now if I click on my instance of conveyor system, I see that I have this new property where I could edit those processing times for those front-end servers on this system. While we're here and we still have these libraries open, if I made another change, and I'm just going to make a quick change to add another property, it's not going to do anything, save this file, and I make a change to my transporter library, and again, just going to add a property, save it, we should see that it's going to ask for if I want to update. Oh, did I save that other one? Save. Huh. Is this that same? Did I load in the right one? Models, transporter library. And transporter library. Oh, my worker is not in that project. So actually I'm going to make a change to my vehicle and save it now. What was going on there in a little bit in terms of object references, but we're going to save that for a second. All right, now if I check for updates, I see that both libraries want to try to update. I'm going to click no for a second. I want to also show that you can hold shift when you check for updates, and it'll give you a more granular option for what you want to update. So here, there are updates for my standard library, but I could say I only want to update my transporter library and not update my conveyor system library. So that would give me my update to my vehicle, and I should be able to see that new property, but my conveyor system has not changed. Some updating, but I want to go back to my PowerPoint and talk a little bit more about what happens when we update. So updating libraries, when an object is changed, an object is tracking its version number. So there's an object reference internal version number that it remembers, and that definition has a version number. Your project where your definition is instantiated also has a version number that it remembers. So anytime your model object references, it tracks the version number of the object that your model is using. When you load a library, the model will check to see if the library's version of that object is newer or the number is greater than the reference that the model is remembering. And again, I'm a more visual person, so I think it kind of helps to go through this. again, we're back in our world of our project with our box definition. Here I've added a line that just shows a revision number. So that's that reference number. If I make a change to the box, so again, I just changed this color, it's going to update to a newer number. It is now version 2. My project, my model, it's still using box revision number 1. If I was to add another box, it still only remembers box number 1. I have not chosen to update my box definition in my project as of yet. So that was that warning, or that kind of like notification message we were getting as we were updating. You know, we're going to be asked, is this something that you want to update? And if we say yes, then we're going to see all of these objects change and get a new revision number that the model remembers. So let's jump back into Simio and kind of look at where we see that information. So we're back in our facility. If you right click on the facility in the navigation pane and go to object references, I think the object references are very helpful when you're working with custom libraries. So here we can see that these are the object references my facility remembers. We could also check their IDs. So if we wanted to go check if our IDs matched from that original project file, we could. And here we have our internal version number. So these are the version numbers that our project remembers. And if we make a change, so let's just take our conveyor system. Our conveyor system is at number 8, or our model is remembering that it's at number 8. If I go back to that library and I right click and look at the properties on my conveyor system, I should be able to see under general that it has a change. So it's at version 9, and that is because we chose not to update the conveyor the last time we asked the model to look for changes. So let's just change our color one more time. We'll do yellow, we'll save. Since we made a change, it has now updated its version number to 10. So when you make a change to an object and save your file, it will update this object's version number. If we go back to the facility and we check for updates, we see that there are updates. We're going to say yes. We see that our instances have updated, and oops, wrong one. And we're going to look at our object references, and we're going to see that the conveyor system is now using number 10, which is great. I do want to note, as I was changing my colors, this was something that lived at the facility level. And so when my instances are kind of updating, it will update my facility animation. If you were updating any of your external animation, you might find that you need to re-instantiate that definition to get that animation change. So that's just something to keep in mind. Okay. So that's how Simio is kind of keeping track of whether this object needs to update from this new library information. Something else about your libraries. It is a absolute file path. So if I was to leave my conveyor system loaded, but move the library to a different file location, so I'm just going to put it in this archive folder. Oops, we're going to actually not put it there. We're going to make a new folder. All right. If I put my library in this new folder, so it's no longer in this file location, which is where my project is expecting it to be. If I make a change, and actually I will need to make sure I'm saving in that same location. So again, I'm just going to change the color to green. So we want to save this in this new folder location. In this case, I'm going to replace it. I go back to my facility and I try to check for updates. It's not going to find any updates because this project is looking for this library at that absolute file location. So that's something to keep in mind. It also will not recognize any updates if the library is not loaded into the project. So if I was to unload it and make a change and save it, it would not know to check for the updates for that library. So when you're trying to update your objects, you do want to make sure that the library is loaded, and you do want to make sure it's pointing to the library at the correct file location. last thing on that is, I'm actually going to load that right back in for a second. And now it'll recognize those changes. If I was to split up our conveyor library even further, so let's say I wanted my custom server in a different library. So my custom server library was now its own thing, and my custom server library would be loaded into my conveyor system because my conveyor system needs these custom servers. And then my conveyor system library is again loaded into my facility. If I made a change to my custom server, so custom server library is updated. If I come to my top level and I try to update my libraries, my conveyor system would not recognize any updates. It would not get the new custom server information. I would have to open my custom server library, update the custom server library, and then move to my top level and update my facility custom server, or oh my gosh, custom conveyor system library. So there is kind of a hierarchy of updating. You cannot force updates in between libraries. You will have to open each library to update. All right. We are now going.
Would you like a 2-minute break here to let me ask a question?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Question on tips. So person's asking, what type of tips do you have to copy or clone a custom object with data tables defined inside the model? How do I reference tables in a custom object when used in a different project?
How do I give it to me all one more time?
Sure. What tips do you have to copy or clone a custom object with data tables defined inside the model? Let's start with that part.
Okay. So the data tables are inside the object, or the data tables are on the top level and the object is using the data tables?
Inside the facility model.
Inside, okay, so I'm going to interpret that as the data tables are on the top level of the model and your objects are using those tables as references. That's a good question. I would say if your object definitions are expecting to use those table references, then wherever you instantiate those definitions next, your tables will need to exist in that project. Something that we would use for that situation might be templates. So you might want to make a project that has that starts from a template with a set of given data tables in it. And you'll kind of see that in our templates. So if you wanted to open something new from template, we have our ISA 95 schemas. So these are projects that open with a set of data tables kind of pre-made. I will also say you don't need to make a template, and you could just add in those data tables at whatever project you start next. And your objects might have design time errors where they're saying, hey, I'm expecting this table reference. And that's a good reminder that you need to add that table reference in, or add those data tables into the model. And sometimes it's okay to have errors. There's an example a little bit later on where my object is expecting some table reference, and so my definition in my library has an error, but when I put my definition as an instance in the project where the data lives, it will be happy and it'll say, okay, now I see this data. So sometimes there are errors that you can kind of ignore if you know that the information will be passed to them eventually. So that was kind of directions.
No, that's good. That's good. Well, the question kind of has multiple parts to it. I'll let you keep going. It sounds like you might be getting to something like this shortly. If we don't address it, we could always leave it open at the end. So I'll pause the questionnaire and let you continue.
Okay, for sure. All right. Great. Jumping back into it, we are now going to talk about object references and what your model knows and what is in your library. And I actually want to jump to another example to demonstrate this. So here we have a project that has two different libraries loaded into it. We have a project A library and a project B library. These are just very basic libraries that contain a server and a resource, and a server and a resource. All right, I'm going to get rid of those. But we will see, as I currently built it, I'm only using server A and resource A. So it's only using the objects from this library. If I was to look at my model references, I would see that my model is only trying, oh, well, since I added those instances in, now it knows about that. But it should only be remembering server A. And to kind of demonstrate that, I'm actually just going to close and reopen that same model. Oops. Nope. All right, main model, here we go. So again, my libraries are here, but my model is only remembering the object references from the instances that currently live in the facility. Typically, we do this so that your project file doesn't have to remember all these different object references. So it's not storing all this information, but your models do store off the things that are currently instantiated in them. So we see server A and resource A because the instances exist here. We don't see server B because there are no instances of server B. And again, that's just us trying to help get rid of unnecessary information. So since both libraries are loaded in, if I actually wanted to kind of use some information about server B, so I said, you know, oops, oh my goodness. Well, I guess it's not going to like that. I could reference server B if I needed to because the library exists here, and then my model would start to remember information about this. So server B, there's nothing really to reference because I don't have an instance of it. But let's say I didn't want to create an instance, but I wanted to have my model remember this. I wanted my model to remember server B and resource B because I might want to use them later and not have these libraries loaded in. I can give my model these references without having to instantiate them into the facility. And before I do that, I just kind of want to also show what this model is doing. This model has these objects data generated. So these are being created from my data table. And I actually have it set up to an external file that will change which objects are being created. So I'm going to change to my different configuration. And if you're curious about data connectors and data configurations, we've talked about this before in some of our other Simio Solution series, but I'm changing to a different configuration which will import my B objects. And if I go back to my facility, I now see my B objects in my facility. So if I don't have these libraries loaded in, and I wanted to kind of experiment between these two different configurations, where I could switch between which objects are being created. If my data doesn't contain the objects I need at that time, my model is going to forget about them if these libraries aren't loaded in here. To have my my library or my model remember them, I can actually go to object references and add and remove. And so this is kind of a useful tip for your model to remember objects that are not currently instantiated in here. So I'm going to say, remember my server A and server B, and my resource A and my resource B. And that way I can unload these libraries, save my model. And if I closed it and opened it, which since we're a little short on time, I'm going to skip doing that again. My model would still have the references to both sets of objects. So now we see that server A and server B are in here. And I could easily just switch between my different configurations, and this might allow me to, run an experiment where I'm trying different configurations. I did not import those. Now we're switching between objects. And so this is a way that you might want to, switch between different libraries if you're data generating or auto creating things, and you don't always have an instance in the model, but you want the model to remember. So this is one time you might want to add or remove object references. And again, you can always get rid of them if you don't want them and you want kind of to get rid of that space and not have your model be as large, remembering all of these object references. We are going to jump into a little bit more of some debugging tools. So I'm actually going to go back to my PowerPoint for a quick second. And when debugging your libraries, a lot of it's the same tools that you would use to kind of debug any part of your model as you're building it. I think trace is really key here. You will see the trace information from any logic that's being executed inside of those other definitions. So even if you're multiple objects into an object, so for example, in my facility, I had my conveyor system, and then my conveyor system had a server. If my server is doing anything, I will get down to that level and see that information happening in trace. And so that's when you really want to pay attention to the object column and which object is enacting the logic. My other favorite things to do when debugging object libraries is to use colored steps and notify steps, kind of as you're going through any process logic and you're trying to figure out if your objects are doing what they need to do. Those are kind of some key debugging tips and tricks. And if you have not gotten to see our other Silumio solution series about debugging, it's a great one to kind of walk through. And a lot of this will be the same concepts, but just applied to a library instead. Breakpoints, something you can use between objects and will be respected. I will say we are trying to do some updating to this breakpoint behavior. Currently, if you put a breakpoint in something, and we're gonna head back to my favorite conveyor system library. If you put a breakpoint in process logic, let's say for example, and you open your breakpoint window, you will only see this breakpoint information as you're in the definition. We're hoping in the future that no matter where you are in the project, you'll have that information, because if you're trying to kind of, debug, you want to see what breakpoints you can easily flip on and off within those objects. I will also say, as you're trying to debug libraries, like any sort of recommendation we have when you're trying to figure out how to model something, we recommend making a smaller example model. So if I was trying to debug some behavior with my custom server, I might not use my conveyor system, which has a bunch of custom servers and a bunch of combiners. I would recommend making like a new small model and placing my custom server here, so I can kind of more isolate looking at what my custom server is doing. So we're going to see that I hit a breakpoint, and I don't see any breakpoints in this window, and that's because it's the breakpoint that I put in my server. So if I turn on trace, I'm actually going to stop and run again. We're going to see some of these kind of tools I recommended, where I colored my steps, I hit a breakpoint. The breakpoint will be per instance of that definition. So if I had another custom server in here, it would also break whenever that custom server hit this logic. Seeing my colored steps, noticing that my object column, it's talking about my custom server 1 instance. These are all little things that'll kind of help you as you're figuring out your object library definition, or sorry, object library behavior. And I quickly want to get to some other things. So animation, you kind of saw how I like to change colors of something that's in the facility so I can quickly see that something has changed. But that also means, adding sort of plots or, status labels that help you read out information. On that same point, this server is actually changing its resource state. So the server is going to change to this purple resource state for a while, which is this cleaning resource state. And if I wanted to make sure custom servers were acting as expected, I could go into that definition and I could, place what do I want here? A pie chart, which is going to look at my resource states. And so then any custom server I place will have that pie chart with it, which will be helpful for me as I'm trying to, check out what's happening with my resource states. And I see I'm changing into my other resource state. I hit my breakpoint. I can look at that pie chart. And if you don't want to have that visible for every single instance, you could also use your console. So that's something that I think a lot of users maybe don't know about, but the console, it's kind of this other little external view. So I could put my pie chart in here, and actually I'm just going to copy this exact one and paste it in here. And now, again, I have to reinstantiate if I'm making external view changes, but if I'm running, there's no longer my chart visible here, but I can open the console for that object and specifically take a look at what's happening inside there. And that way I could close it if I no longer want to see it, and I can always open it back up again. So the console is another kind of little cool thing to kind of take a look at if you're debugging and whatnot. I will say that that is for the whole instance. I would not be able to go to my facility model and open the console for the server used in the conveyor system. I could only open a console that was the conveyor system's console. All right. Want to get to another example. You could also use watch. Watch will allow you to kind of look into those instances as well and get that information. So a lot of these are kind of the common debugging techniques we'll recommend. Logs, you can log information inside of other objects or submodels or objects down in your hierarchy, and it will bubble up to your top level model log information. And we are just quickly going to jump to a different example. All right. So here, this is an older file version, but here I have turned on my logging information for these servers. If I run this facility, which this all lives in the same model for the sake of this example, I can go to my logs and I will see my information about the custom server and which conveyor system it lives in. So you do have to pay attention to kind of that diving down into each object level. So my conveyor systems, all of them are going to have a custom server 1. So I need to pay attention if I'm looking at conveyor system 3 instance or conveyor system 1 instance to see which custom server 1 I care about. But you can get that information in there, which is very cool. All right. Running a bit at a time, and I actually am going to jump to another concept before we try to get to some of these questions. But the last thing I want to talk about is a common problem, which is if you have things with the same name. We really don't recommend having definitions with the same name. It's going to cause a lot of confusion. You'll see this a lot with the model entity definition. As I said in the beginning, each project has a model entity definition. And that's because a lot of the times we want to make changes to that entity definition so that we can have these unique things on our entities. We do recommend if you're making a library, rename your model entity definition, change it to something else so that when you put that library in another project, those model entity definitions aren't in conflict. If you see that, warning triangle, warning sign on any of your object definitions, it typically has to do with the fact that you had definitions with the same name and now the project is unsure which definition it should be trying to use because it doesn't know if it likes the library definition more than the project definition. There's a little bit of conflict there. So just try to always remember to use different naming conventions. And then along with that, I think it's kind of important to keep in mind as you're building your libraries and you're debugging your libraries, what you can see into in an object. So in my top level model, what can I reference about the objects that live in there? So I think about it kind of like looking down into an object and what I can see. And a lot of this has to do with paying attention to the object references you have. So we've kind of been talking a little bit about object references and what object references the model has. But so whatever object reference we see, we can look at its definitions, the things we've defined in its states and properties. We can look at its processes so we can execute that object's process. And you can now look at its tables. So this is something newer we added in 17.261 where you can reference another object's tables now, which is really helpful. But this means that it's your top level model looking into the object referenced in it, that table, that lives inside that object. And there's a great snippet that kind of discusses that a bit further and shows some examples of how you might want to use a data table or might use an output table. So I highly recommend that if you are in 261. And if you ever want to find the name of the snippets, we do put them in the release notes. So you can kind of look through our release notes that are available in the support ribbon and see what snippets are new for that version. In that same line, though, I think it's kind of really important to just take one more second and talk about how you can get information in the objects from your library. So let's say I have my top model and I have loaded in a library that has these submodels. I have my submodel 1 instance and my submodel 2 instance. To get more information, I don't need to start with my top model. I'm currently editing my top model. I can see everything in my top model. So if I wanted to ask what my top model's property was, I could just start with property. But if I want to get information about what's in my submodel, I have to start with submodel. So we're gonna write a little expression here that's kind of casting down to see how we can get information within other objects. And I think this also helps with kind of debugging as you're thinking about the information you have available to you at different parts of your model. So I'm in my top model, I want to see something in my submodel. So now that I have said I'm starting with my submodel, I can see the objects inside of that submodel. So I can see that my submodel 1 has 2 instances of cell 1 and 2. I'm going to go a level further and say I'm now referencing something in cell 1. So now I'm looking into cell 1. We're just going to make that larger for the sake of this example. And inside cell 1, I can see that there are more instances of a different object. So I could get into these instances now that I've said I'm diving down into cell 1. We're going to say I want to look at server 1. So now we can look inside server 1 to get its information, which is, we could look at maybe its stations. So the server has an input station, a processing station, an output station, and stations are elements. So we would want to say we want to look at the server's processing station. So now we're focused down in on that element. Inside the processing station, we can hold entities. So now we're looking at the entities inside of the processing station. And we do have to specify which thing in the processing station we want to use. Stations typically have an index-based system, but you can say, I just want to look at the first item. That's a function available for stations. And the first item, we actually don't know what it could be. It could be, a worker. It could be a vehicle. Those are things that could also be in a station. Typically, it is an entity. In this case, though, we do need to say that it's going to be a model entity. And once we say it's a model entity, then we can get the information about that model entity's definition. So, the model entity definitions have a bunch of information that kind of comes pre-built, but if you had added any custom states to that definition, we could, get into that level as well. And so let's just say we want to take the priority. So now that's how we could get to the priority of something that lived kind of way down within all of these objects. And I just think this is kind of important to think about, as you're trying to get certain pieces of information and access that, think about how you're casting into those objects. All right, we skipped over a couple things. I know we had that table question. I did not get to that example, but is there any other questions for right now that we want to kind of talk about? And I can be happy to ask or answer other things later.
Yeah, let's jump into it. So we have about 4 or 5 minutes left. So in interest of time, let me jump into a couple of these. I think you might have answered this one, but I'm going to ask it just in case because it came in early and it kind of slipped by. Does a subclass definition get a new object ID?
That's a great question. I actually think let's just go to Simio. As we're trying to learn more about what we can do in Simio, I don't always remember things off the top of my head, so I think it's good to explore. So we can use some of those tools we just talked about to find this out together. As we talked about, copying a definition is going to give it a new ID. But if we're subclassing, so let's just subclass a worker. So we subclassed a worker. We're actually going to subclass 2 workers. We're going to subclass our worker we just subclassed. And that is because we can now put our worker and our my worker into Simio. And we have this in our model, and we could check our model's object references. So if they did not get, okay, so our my worker has this ID, and our my worker has a different ID. So subclassing does give you a different ID. It's, not going to copy over that same ID. The only time you'll get the same ID is from cloning. But this is just a good way you can always kind of test these things out as you're working along.
Perfect. All right, jump into a couple of the questions we have before we end here. When would you suggest users subclass instead of copy and vice versa?
Subclass versus copy and vice versa. Great. So subclassing, you are going to be related to whatever information your parent has. So since we're already here, this is great. We have our my worker, that's the parent of our my worker. So if I make a change to my worker, and again, I'm just going to add some properties here. My worker should also inherit those properties. So if we go to definitions and properties, we should see that we have inherited these pieces of information from our my worker. So you would subclass when you want there to be link between these two definitions and allow the child's class to inherit from its parent class. If you did not want that relationship, like you did not want my worker influencing this second definition we created, that's when we would want to copy. Because copying would say, okay, I'm starting from this my worker point, but now I am totally independent. I will not inherit anything that my worker gets or is changed. I think that's my summary for that.
All right, perfect. Is there a limit on how many libraries or objects per library there can be inside of Simio?
Is there a limit on the objects? I don't believe there is. You could put as many objects in a library as you want. Your file might get very large and it might take a while to load. So that is something to consider. Is there is a little bit of a loading speed as you're loading your library into projects. So if you're finding that it's kind of taking a long time to load, you might split it up into smaller libraries. But I don't believe there is a limit. It's just purely computational speed and size, I guess.
Okay. All right. Questions are rolling in. I'm going to do something here real quick. I'm going to steal presentation back from you.
Sure.
And I'm going to go back to PowerPoint real quick and share our contact information just in case we don't get to one of these questions here. I want to make sure people at least can get in touch with us. So there is right there the bring that up to large so everyone can see it. Maybe. Nope, it's going to still show that way. Well, there's our contact information. If you want to reach directly out to one of us, if you do have a question on that does not get addressed today, because like I said, we are running out of time and I know the questions are still rolling in, I'd highly recommend sending an email to Liz or myself. Also in regards to the QR code, I mentioned this early, but mentioning it again, the QR code, if you can scan that and give us your feedback on today's session and any type of suggestions for future. All right, one more question, then we'll wrap up. I'll give you presentation back, or if you need presentation back, just let me know if you want to show something. But is there any way I can edit an object in a standard library without subclassing it?
You want to edit a library in the standard library without subclassing it.
Edit an object. Edit an object in the standard library without subclassing.
Okay, I would highly recommend copying it then, not subclassing. I would copy it into your own project and make your changes there, because then it'll give you the same starting point as whatever is in your standard library. If you truly want to change the standard library, you can go find that file with your Simio installation. I would not recommend that though, as I believe every time if you were to get a new version of Simio, it would kind of overwrite whatever standard library version you have there. You could also probably just go find that standard library file and copy a version of that file off if you wanted to kind of, kind of start from the standard library and then create something new based on the standard library. I would not edit the kind of source of truth standard library there though. And I cannot recall the exact location of where the standard library lives in the file system. It's probably somewhere with your Simio installation files, your Simio program files. So you could kind of look for it, but I would more so recommend just copying the standard library object you need into your current project and starting to build your own library there instead.
All right, perfect. All right, well, we are out of time. Thank you everyone for attending today. We do appreciate the questions that came in. If we did not address your question, once again, showing on the screen is both my email address as well as Liz's. Feel free to reach out directly to one of us, ask your question if it didn't get addressed, and we will see everyone again in about a month, July 18th, Batching Logic. Hope to see you there. Thanks again, and goodbye. Thanks, Liz.